In this section, we're going to look at water resources. In other words, where does water come from and where does it accumulate? This is a graph, visual, that shows quite a bit of information. You have to look at it closely to understand it all. This pie chart is showing all of the water that's on the earth, and you can look at this and see that 97% is saline, which means salt water. It's all residing in the ocean. So that only leaves us with a tiny sliver of 3% of the water that we have on Earth is fresh water that's usable for us to drink, and that we need for crop irrigation and any other use. Really, we need that fresh water. So we take that little 3% sliver of this pie and we make this pie chart. Of that 3%, 68, almost 69% of that fresh water is actually stored in ice caps and glaciers. So again, that's not really in a form that we're able to use readily, and it's not in a very good location for us most times either. The other big chunk of that fresh water is in groundwater. So 30% of that is groundwater. That literally means water that's in the ground. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's underneath the ground, so to get to that water you're going to have to drill a well or have some type of device to get that water out. A tiny 0.3%, this little sliver here, is surface water. And another 0.9%, I think they kind of messed up their arrows here a little bit, but is other sources of water. So that might be things like the water vapor and things like that. But the surface water are things that we actually see when we think about fresh water. So that would be water that's in our rivers in Pittsburgh, our big three rivers, or lakes, things like that. Okay. Of that surface water, here again, we have that visual, I guess I should have waited. Lakes are 87%, rivers 2%, and swamps, look at this, swamps actually have more water in them than our rivers do. So a lot of times when we think about surface water or fresh water, we probably, and maybe we're a little bit biased in Pittsburgh, we often think of the rivers, but actually more of that water is in lakes. And I guess maybe you only have to look up north to Lake Erie and the other Great Lakes to understand how much water that would be. So how does this water get from place to place? This is called the hydrologic cycle, or you probably called it in your earlier learnings, the water cycle. This is not the biggest picture, but there's a lot of words on here that I expect that you would probably know. You've covered this in biology class in ninth grade. You've covered it probably in middle school and even elementary school. We've added a few more terms to it, maybe than you had back at the elementary level. So probably the first thing to recognize here is that water, whenever it leaves the surface, it evaporates. So you should know the term evaporation. The next thing the water does once it gets up into the atmosphere, it condenses. When you actually see clouds, those are that's not water vapor, but it's actually water molecules that are condensed at that state. Water is often stored in the atmosphere. Those clouds often keep their formation for a long time. Whenever you watch the weather on the news, you'll see this big set of clouds coming from the west to the east across the United States, or up from the south, etc., to us here in Pennsylvania. And then we have precipitation, right? Once we have precipitation, that's going to be how our water might be stored in ice and snow over here. That snow is going to melt, runoff, and a couple other types. If we just have precipitation in the form of rain, we might have some surface runoff, but we also have some that's going to actually what we call recharge the groundwater and seep into the ground. There's one other word on here I want you to make sure you point out here is sublimation. This is when water that's in the form of ice and snow just goes directly to the gaseous phase and just goes immediately to vapor instead of going through the liquid phase. Okay? So we have words to know: evaporation, condensation, sublimation, precipitation, surface runoff, and another word here is transpiration also. That's they call it evapotranspiration here, but transpiration is whenever the water comes off of trees and plants, things like that. And then we have freshwater storage in this underground portion. An important thing for you to know for this course are some water resources. This has a map of the United States, of course, and you don't need to know all of these rivers that are listed here, but I think you should know some of the major ones. The one closest to us here in Pittsburgh, the Ohio River, and it comes down and joins in with the Mississippi. Most times when you look globally, people around the world kind of consider the Mississippi, and then up here the Missouri River, which goes up this direction, goes all the way over here, as kind of one of the longest river systems that there are, because this branch actually that branches out into the Missouri is actually longer than this one branch that is the Mississippi. Another big river to recognize is the Rio Grande here through Texas, the Colorado River. This is the one that flows through the Grand Canyon. Both of these, the Colorado and the Rio Grande, then go into Mexico. And up here in Washington State is the Columbia River, another big river. Kind of take note, we'll be talking about this more, the absence of rivers in this section of the country. On a global scale, we have some pretty big rivers that you should remember as well. The Amazon is the largest river by volume, and it's located in South America and goes through the countries of Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. It is the largest by volume, meaning it has the greatest amount of discharge. It has more water flowing through it than any other river on the earth. The Amur River is located in eastern Russia and northeast China. The Congo River is in Africa. It's recognized as the deepest river, in some places over 600 feet deep, more than most lakes around the world. And it is in the country of Congo, Gabon, and it empties into the Atlantic Ocean. The Missouri Mississippi that we talked about in the U.S. The Nile River is unique for a lot of rivers. It actually flows north and goes into the Mediterranean Sea. It is known as the longest river on the earth, and it is in the Congo and South Sudan. The Ob River system is in West Russia and also empties into the Arctic Ocean. The Parana River is in south central South America, and it goes through the countries of Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, through a lot of those rainforest areas. The Yangtze River is the longest river in Asia, and it empties into the East China Sea. And then we have the Yellow River in China. Sometimes it's often called in China the Mother River because it's considered the heart of the Chinese civilization, and it's had a lot of long history with it as far as the Chinese population and some flooding and that characteristic yellow color to it. Some other resources, we said lakes make up the largest amount of fresh water. So one of those is the Caspian Sea. That's the largest. The Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, in the U.S. are second largest. And you can see Lake Superior comes in third, with Lake Victoria located in Africa, in the countries of Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. Another one we'll be talking about quite a bit is the Aral Sea. Well, it has a very unique environmental history to it. That's located in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and then some others as well. As we mentioned earlier, water resources, one of the big places we have our resources are in glaciers and ice sheets. And even though they make up just 2% of all water, there are nearly 70% of all fresh water. And the largest ice sheets on the earth are located in Antarctica and Greenland. And it's often these ice sheets that are studied when scientists look at climate change, and they grab these, they use some very high-tech methods to obtain these ice core and study the ice core data to look at the weather history and climate history for thousands of years. Whenever we do have water that is groundwater, where does it go, right? It goes into a region that's known as an aquifer, and these are regions underground that are made up of a porous type rock. These are two types. There's two types, one called confined and one called unconfined. And One of the most important aquifers actually in the world, and one of the largest in the world, is called the Ogallala Aquifer, located in the central U.S. Here's where the Ogallala Aquifer is, and you can see it stretches all the way from South Dakota all the way down to Texas, and pretty much supplies water to all of these states that are very big agricultural states, farming and ranching, and meet the needs of a lot of people in the U.S. A aquifer that is considered confined, it has this layer. This, even though this is showing all blue, it's not like there's just one big pit of water underneath. This is actually water that would be confined and still trapped within some rocks. But it has a impermeable layer of rock both above and below it. So this would be rock that the water cannot get through above and below, and this is an area where the water can enter into that rock. And to get to that aquifer, you would need to have some sort of well system and a pump house to draw that water out of that. An unconfined aquifer might be more in a hill or a valley, and so you see that here's the water table, which means that's kind of like the part underground where you first would hit water. And you see if you live up on a hill, you might have to dig very, very far to get that to that and tap into that aquifer. But because of the terrain and the topography of the area, this big hill here has kind of lets that water table meet the surface, and you have a stream or a river. So what kind of decides this? Well, the idea that decides where your water goes is known as a watershed. And what this picture is trying to show you is there are regions, we call them usually a divide, and these are at the tops of mountains, basically the highest point in a region, or topographically. So if you were standing here on this hill and you dropped some water over on this side, it would go down in this direction. If you turned around and dropped water over here, it would fall down the other direction. And you might notice this when maybe some of you have driven to the beach on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and you might pass a sign, I think it's a little bit past Somerset, but that it says, "Now entering the Chesapeake Bay watershed." And so that means once you cross that line, any water that falls to the ground is going to go into the Chesapeake Bay. On the other hand, if it stays on this west side of that, then it's going to go into the Ohio River Basin. This is a map that's showing some of those water regions, watershed regions, and another name they give them are drainage basins. And you can see that all of this huge, huge green area is everything that drains into the Mississippi, Missouri River area. This small area of Texas goes into the Gulf Coast. This is the South Atlantic Gulf, so it goes into this part of the Gulf. All this area at the north goes into the North Atlantic Ocean. These just feed into, of course, the Great Lakes. This feeds into the Columbia River area. This is known as the Great Basin, and it's kind of unusual in that there's really no drainage actually at all going on there. And this is the Colorado River and the Rio Grande area. So you can see how those rivers that we talked about earlier pretty much usually name the drainage areas or watersheds. One thing you can often do with watersheds, though, is break them up into even smaller segments. And we're going to be trying to do this in class, I think, later this week. If we take a look at just the state of Pennsylvania, we can see again, here's that dividing line that as you cross, I guess that is past, a little bit past Somerset County, right into Bedford County, that you cross that line along the turnpike going along here, and there's going to be that sign that says the Chesapeake Water Basin. So all the water that flows on this side is going to flow into the Ohio River. All the river that flows on this side is going to go into the Susquehanna and the Chesapeake. The Potomac River is going to drain here, and that Potomac also drains into the Chesapeake, just in a different region than this does. The Delaware Basin actually goes into what's called the Delaware Bay, and that goes right into, right below, I think, Cape May, and goes right into the Atlantic Ocean. And we've got this little small drainage basin area up here by Erie that actually flows and goes into Lake Erie. So there's several streams here up by Lake Erie. If you've ever heard about people going up to Erie to go fishing, This is where they catch some of those steelhead, and they go up here and then go to these streams that just flow this direction and right into the lake. So you can see that each watershed